The field at Waterloo is not a single place, but a convergence, a shallow basin of Belgian farmland where three roads meet, where the earth dips and rises in deceptive folds, and where the mud holds memory like a grave holds bone. On the morning of June 18th, 1815, the ground was already exhausted. 2 days of summer rain had turned the wheat fields into a slurry of clay and trampled crops. The air hung thick with moisture, and the sky remained the color of old iron. From the ridge at Mont Saint Jean, the Duke of Wellington's Anglo-Allied army held a defensive line stretching nearly 3 miles, anchored by farmhouses that would soon become abattoirs. Hougoumont to the west, La Haye-Sainte in the center, Papelotte to the east. To the south, across a shallow valley no wider than 1,000 yards, Napoleon's Armée du Nord assembled in columns that seemed to ripple with banners and bayonets, 72,000 men and 246 guns preparing to shatter the coalition that had hounded them from Russia to France. This was the arithmetic of empire's end. Wellington commanded 67,000 infantry, cavalry, and artillery drawn from a patchwork of nations: British Redcoats, King's German Legion Hussars, Dutch-Belgian militia, Hanoverian line battalions, Nassau contingents. Against them, the French deployed veteran divisions hardened by 20 years of continental war, men who had marched from Madrid to Moscow and back, whose eagles had been blessed by an emperor who believed himself destiny incarnate. Between these two forces lay a stretch of farmland that would consume more than 40,000 lives before sunset. The ground itself would become a participant, the mud slowing cavalry charges to a crawl, the rye fields concealing entire battalions until they rose like apparitions, the sunken lane of Ohain Road swallowing horses and riders into a trench they could not escape. But there is an older memory beneath Waterloo, one that does not appear in the dispatches of Uxbridge or the journals of Soult. The local Walloon farmers, those who had not fled south toward Charleroi or north toward Brussels, spoke in low voices of Les Cavaliers Gris, the Grey Riders. The phrase appears in parish records dating to the 15th century, always associated with the days before great bloodshed. In 1489, before the Battle of Bossuet, witnesses reported mounted figures moving through fog that had no source. In 1635, prior to a massacre during the 30 Years' War, a miller's son claimed he saw armored horsemen riding through his father's field at dawn, their hoofbeats making no sound. The local clergy dismissed these accounts as peasant superstition, the sort of folklore that grows in regions where the soil has been plowed and replowed by war for 1,000 years. But the stories persisted, passed down in Walloon and Flemish, always describing the same details: riders in outdated armor or uniform, moving in formation, visible only in peripheral vision or the uncertain light of early morning, gone the moment one looked directly at them. On the night of June 17th, as both armies settled into uncomfortable bivouacs in the rain-soaked darkness, several British sentries reported unusual activity near the Ohain Road. The accounts were fragmentary and inconsistent. Some claimed to have seen lanterns moving in patterns that suggested a column on the march. Others described the sound of cavalry at the walk, the jingle of tack and scabbards, but no visual confirmation. Captain Alexander Kennedy Cavalier Mercer of G Troop, Royal Horse Artillery, noted in his journal that his horses became inexplicably agitated around 2 in the morning, stamping and pulling at their tethers despite no visible cause. He attributed it to the approaching storm. By dawn, the matter was forgotten. There were more immediate concerns. Napoleon's guns would begin their bombardment within hours, and every officer knew that the battle to come would determine whether Europe remained under Bonaparte's shadow or finally broke free. What none of them knew, what would not be understood until much later, if at all, was that Waterloo had already been fought. Not once, but many times. And some of those who had fallen there had never truly left. The battle had begun at 20 minutes past 11 with the French assault on Hougoumont, a walled chateau on Wellington's right flank that would burn for the next 7 hours. But for Major General Sir William Ponsonby's Union Brigade, composed of the 1st Royal Dragoons, the 6th Inniskilling Dragoons, and the 2nd Royal North British Dragoons, known as the Scots Greys, the morning was still a matter of waiting. They sat their mounts in column behind the ridge, 2,000 heavy cavalry in scarlet coats and gray horses, their sabers drawn and resting against their shoulders, watching the smoke rise from the chateau and listening to the percussion of artillery that rolled across the valley like a continuous peal of thunder. Ponsonby himself was an experienced officer, 43 years old, a veteran of the Peninsula campaigns who had led cavalry at Talavera and Vitoria. He commanded from the center of his brigade, mounted on a chestnut mare that had carried him through Spain and now pawed nervously at the mud. His orders were explicit: hold position until Wellington gave the signal to advance. The Duke's tactical doctrine relied on concealing his strength behind the reverse slope of the ridge, keeping his infantry and cavalry invisible to French observers until the moment of commitment. It was a strategy that required discipline and patience, two qualities not naturally associated with heavy cavalry, but Ponsonby's men had learned to trust Wellington's judgment. They had seen what happened to formations that charged without orders. To their left, Major General Sir John Ormsby Vandeleur's Light Cavalry Brigade, the 11th, 12th, and 16th Light Dragoons, waited in similar reserve, their mounts smaller and faster, suited for pursuit and skirmishing rather than the shock action that heavy cavalry delivered. To their right, Lieutenant General Henry William Paget, Earl of Uxbridge, Wellington's cavalry commander, sat on his gray charger and observed the French positions through a brass telescope. Uxbridge was arguably the finest cavalry officer in the British Army, a man who had led the mounted rearguard during the retreat to Corunna and whose personal courage was beyond question. He had already identified the likely axis of Napoleon's main attack. The French would attempt to break Wellington's center, driving up the Brussels road through La Haye-Sainte, and when that assault came, the heavy cavalry would be committed to throw it back. But there were complications that morning, details that did not fit the expected pattern of Napoleonic tactics. Several staff officers had reported unusual observations during the pre-dawn hours. Captain William Werner of the 7th Hussars, conducting reconnaissance along the Ohain Road at first light, encountered what he described as a formed body of cavalry, perhaps 30 strong, moving west to east across our front at a distance of some 400 yards. He had immediately sent a galloper back to headquarters with the sighting, assuming it was a French probe. But when a squadron from the 23rd Light Dragoons was dispatched to investigate, they found no trace of any enemy force, no hoofprints in the soft ground, no vedettes watching from the tree line, nothing. Werner's report was filed and forgotten. Battlefield fog and nerves, most likely. Then there was the matter of the horses. Across multiple cavalry regiments, grooms and farriers reported that their mounts had become agitated during the night, not in response to any visible stimulus, but in waves, as if reacting to something passing through their lines. The phenomenon had occurred 3 times, once around midnight, again at 2 in the morning, and finally just before dawn. Each time, the horses would stamp and whinny, ears pinned back, eyes rolling white, and then after 2 or 3 minutes, they would settle. The officers attributed it to the approaching storm, or perhaps wolves in the nearby woods, though no wolves had been seen or heard. One trooper from the Scots Greys, a Highlander named Malcolm Fraser, who had been raised on his grandfather's stories of the Second Sight, remarked to his sergeant that the horses could smell death coming. The sergeant told him to shut his mouth and check his girth straps. At 11:45, the French artillery opened a general bombardment. 80 guns positioned on a low ridge south of La Haye-Sainte began firing into Wellington's center, the round shot screaming overhead or plowing furrows through the British infantry lying flat behind the crest. The sound was immense, a cascading roar that made conversation impossible and set the teeth on edge. Ponsonby's cavalry, still in reserve, could do nothing but endure the barrage and wait. Some of the men began to sing low, repetitive hymns or marching songs, not out of courage, but simply to have something to do with their mouths besides gritting them shut. The horses, curiously, seemed calmer now than they had been during the night. It was as if the actual violence of battle was less disturbing to them than whatever they had sensed in the darkness. What none of the cavalrymen could see from their position behind the ridge was the movement beginning in the valley below. The massing of d'Erlon's Vermcorps, 18,000 French infantry in 4 divisional columns, preparing to advance up the slope in an assault that would decide the battle's center. And none of them noticed, in the smoke and confusion, that along the sunken Ohain road, where the mud was deepest and the shadows longest, there were already riders waiting. Riders whose uniforms did not match any regiment present that day, whose horses left no tracks, and whose patience had outlasted empires. The French infantry had been climbing the slope for nearly 20 minutes, their columns black against the trampled grain, when Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Clifton of the 1st Royal Dragoons noticed something that made him pull his mount to an abrupt halt. He had been riding along the reverse slope, checking the spacing of his squadrons, when he glanced down into the sunken Ohain road that cut laterally across Wellington's position. The lane was ancient, worn deep into the earth by centuries of farm traffic, its banks rising 6 to 8 feet on either side and choked with blackberry bramble and young oak. It was exactly the sort of terrain feature that could conceal troops from enemy observation, which was why Wellington had positioned several companies of the 95th Rifles there earlier that morning. But what Clifton saw in the lane was not the rifles. Through gaps in the vegetation, he caught glimpses of mounted figures, perhaps 20 or 30 of them, formed in a loose double rank and facing south toward the French positions. The configuration was wrong. British cavalry doctrine called for squadrons to form in line with a front of approximately 80 men and a depth of 2 ranks. These riders were clustered too closely, their formation older somehow, reminiscent of the cavalry tactics Clifton had seen in historical paintings, dragoons from an earlier war perhaps, or Continental cavalry using obsolete formations. Their uniforms appeared gray in the shadows beneath the trees, though the light was poor and smoke drifted across everything. What troubled him most was the stillness. Cavalry at rest will always show movement, horses tossing heads, men shifting weight in their saddles, the constant small adjustments of mounted troops, under tension. These riders did not move at all. Clifton spurred his horse forward, intending to investigate, but at that moment a staff officer galloped up with new orders from Uxbridge. The Union Brigade was to prepare to advance. The French assault had reached the crest, and Wellington's infantry were falling back under pressure. Clifton wheeled his mount and returned to his regiment, the image of those strange riders already fading in the urgency of imminent action. He would think of them later, in the days after the battle, when he tried to reconstruct the sequence of events that followed. But by then, it would be impossible to separate what he had actually seen from what his exhausted mind had constructed in the aftermath. Further east, along the line, Sergeant Ewart of the Scots Greys experienced something similar. A big man from Kilmarnock, who had been a blacksmith before enlisting, Ewart had the sort of steady temperament that made him valuable in combat, slow to panic, quick to follow orders, strong enough to control his horse in the chaos of a charge. He had positioned himself on the right flank of his squadron, near where the Ohain road intersected with a farm track, and while he waited for the order to advance, he occupied himself by checking his sword edge and watching the smoke. That was when he heard the horses, not the mounts around him, but others, somewhere close by, moving at a walk. The sound was distinct, the particular rhythm of shod hooves on packed earth, the jingle of curb chains, the creak of saddle leather under weight. It came from his right, from the direction of the sunken road, and it lasted perhaps 15 seconds before fading completely. Ewart turned to the trooper beside him, a young Glaswegian named Campbell, and asked if he had heard it. Campbell nodded slowly, his face pale beneath the grime and sweat. "Aye, Sergeant. Sounded like a full troop at least. Moving up the lane." They both stared at the opening where the farm track descended into the O'Hane Road, expecting to see British cavalry emerging, perhaps a scouting party returning, or reinforcements moving into position. But nothing appeared. The sound did not repeat. After a moment, Campbell said quietly, "My grandmother told me about this. She said before Culloden, the night before, men heard the pipes playing in the glen, but there was no piper there." Ewart told him to keep his Highland nonsense to himself and watch his front. But he did not forget it. The pattern repeated across the Anglo-Allied line that afternoon. A captain of the King's German Legion reported seeing what he initially took to be French cuirassiers moving through the smoke near La Haye-Sainte. But when he trained his glass on them, they resolved into nothing, just shadow and drifting powder smoke. A lieutenant of the 92nd Foot, positioned in square to receive cavalry, swore afterward that he had seen a formed body of horsemen pass within 50 yards of his square's flank without attacking, moving as if they were on parade, ignoring the British infantry entirely. An artillery officer, Captain Mercer, the same man whose horses had been disturbed during the night, observed through his telescope what appeared to be cavalry forming in the dead ground near the O'Hane Road, but when he shifted his view to get a better angle, they were no longer there. Each of these incidents lasted only moments. Each was dismissed by the observer as a trick of light, fatigue, or the confusion inherent in any large-scale engagement. But there was one account that could not be so easily explained. It came from a Belgian guide attached to Uxbridge's staff, a local farmer named Dubois, who had been pressed into service to help the British cavalry navigate the unfamiliar terrain. Dubois was illiterate and spoke only broken English, but he had lived his entire life within 5 miles of Mont-Saint-Jean and knew every field, lane, and hedgerow. When questioned later by a British officer compiling after-action reports, he insisted, despite being told repeatedly that he must be mistaken, that he had seen a cavalry regiment he did not recognize. Not French, not British, not Dutch or German. The uniform was wrong, he said. Too old, like something from his grandfather's time, or before. When pressed for details, he became agitated and would only repeat one phrase in Walloon: "Les morts chevauchent encore." The dead ride again. The officer noted this in his report under unreliable native testimony and gave it no further consideration. But Dubois refused to return to the battlefield after that day, even to help recover the wounded or bury the dead. He sold his farm within a year and moved south to Namur, where he would not have to look at the ridge at Mont-Saint-Jean. When asked by his priest why he had abandoned land his family had worked for 4 generations, he would only say that some ground demands too high a rent and he would not pay it again. The Union Brigade went over the crest at 2 in the afternoon, cresting the ridge in 3 distinct waves: the Royals on the left, the Inniskillings in the center, the Scots Greys on the right, and what they saw below them was the entire French War Corps committed to the slope, 18,000 men in massive divisional columns struggling upward through mud that had become a morass. The British heavy cavalry descended on them like an avalanche. Ponsonby's regiment struck the French columns with such force that entire battalions dissolved on contact, men throwing down their muskets and running or simply standing frozen as the big gray horses crashed through their formations. The Scots Greys overran the 45th Ligne, captured the Eagle of the 105th, and drove deep into the French position, sabers rising and falling in the mechanical rhythm of men who had trained for this moment their entire military lives. But cavalry warfare follows an immutable law. A charge successful becomes a charge uncontrollable. The Union Brigade did not stop at the French infantry. They continued down the forward slope into the valley, scattering the French gunners, sabering the artillery crews, then driving south toward Napoleon's main position on the opposing ridge. They had broken the French assault completely, achieved everything Wellington could have asked for, and then exceeded their orders by nearly a mile. Uxbridge, watching from the crest, could see what was about to happen. The heavy cavalry were blown, their horses exhausted by the uphill charge and the subsequent pursuit, scattered across a half-mile front with no formed reserves behind them. And from the French positions, he could already see the response forming. Milhaud's cuirassiers and lancers, fresh cavalry moving to cut off the British retreat. Ponsonby attempted to recall his regiments. Trumpeters sounded the rally, officers screamed themselves hoarse, trying to restore order, but momentum is a physical force and cannot be countermanded by sound. The Scots Greys found themselves isolated at the bottom of the valley, intermixed with French fugitives, their horses heaving and foam-covered, when the French cavalry counterattack struck them from 3 directions simultaneously. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter. The British heavy cavalry, caught in broken ground with blown horses and no supporting infantry, were ridden down systematically. Ponsonby himself was killed by French lancers, run through while mounted on a horse too exhausted to carry him clear. The Scots Greys lost nearly half their strength in 15 minutes. The survivors fought their way back up the slope in scattered groups, harried by French cavalry and unable to reform. It was during this retreat, in the chaos between the French gun line and the Ohain Road, that the first clear sighting occurred. Cornet Francis Kinchant of the Royals, 20 years old and in his first major engagement, found himself separated from his squadron with perhaps a dozen other dragoons, all of them trying to make their way back to British lines through smoke so thick they could barely see 20 yards. They could hear the French cavalry behind them, the distinctive sound of cuirass plates and the shouted commands in French, and Kinchant was certain they would be overtaken within minutes. Then, emerging from the smoke directly ahead, he saw them. A formed body of cavalry, perhaps 30 strong, riding in 2 ranks at a steady trot. They wore gray coats, not the light gray of French dragoons, but a darker shade, almost the color of weathered stone. And their helmets were of an older pattern, with horsehair crests and brass fittings that looked dull even in the diffuse light. What struck Kinchant immediately was their formation. They maintained perfect dressing, each horse exactly aligned with its neighbors, moving with the mechanical precision of a parade ground evolution. No cavalry in combat, exhausted and pursued, maintained that kind of discipline, and they were not responding to the battle around them. A squadron of French hussars passed within 100 yards, clearly visible despite the smoke, and the gray riders did not acknowledge them. They simply continued their steady advance toward the Ohain Road. Kinchant called out to them in English, assuming they must be King's German Legion cavalry, whose uniform he did not recognize. They did not respond. He spurred his exhausted mount forward, intending to join their formation and take advantage of their protection. But as he closed the distance, something happened that he would struggle to articulate in his written account 3 days later. The closer he came, the less substantial they appeared. Not transparent, he could still see them clearly, could make out individual details like the chabraques on their saddles and the scabbards at their sides, but somehow less present, as if they existed in a slightly different version of the same space he occupied, and there was no sound. 30 horses at the trot should have been audible, especially in the relative quiet between artillery salvos, but he could hear nothing from them. No hoofbeats, no jingle of equipment, no breathing from the horses or the riders. He pulled his mount to a halt. The gray riders continued past him, close enough that he could have reached out and touched the nearest horse's flank. He did not. Some instinct deeper than training told him that would be a mistake. He watched them ride through the smoke toward the sunken road, their formation never wavering. And then they were gone, not obscured by smoke, but simply absent, as if a curtain had been drawn. The dozen dragoons with him had seen them too. None of them spoke. They made their way back to British lines in silence, and when they reached the ridge and dismounted among the remnants of their regiment, Quinchant found that his hands were shaking so badly he could not unbuckle his sword belt. 2 hours later, as the battle continued and the French launched their massive cavalry attacks against Wellington's infantry squares, other sightings accumulated. A sergeant of the 95th Rifles, positioned in the Ohain Road itself, reported that a body of cavalry had ridden through his position, not over his men, but through them, passing between riflemen standing less than 6 feet apart without acknowledging their presence. A captain of the 42nd Highlanders, standing in square and repelling repeated French cavalry charges, observed horsemen moving parallel to his square's face, riding from west to east at a walk, completely ignoring the battle raging around them. Their uniform was not contemporary to any army he knew. When the French cavalry withdrew and his square advanced, he looked for hoofprints where the riders had been. The ground there was undisturbed. By 5 in the afternoon, as the battle reached its climax with the advance of Napoleon's Imperial Guard, the Grey Riders had been seen by at least 24 witnesses from 4 different regiments. But no one spoke of it. Not during the battle, when there were more immediate concerns, and not immediately after, when exhaustion and trauma made memory uncertain. The accounts only began to surface later, in private letters and journals, in conversations between officers who had known each other long enough to risk speaking of something that might be mistaken for cowardice or madness. And what emerged from those fragmentary testimonies was a pattern. The riders always appeared in moments of greatest danger, always moved toward the Ohain Road, and always vanished without engaging either side. They were not fighting the battle. They were simply riding through it, as if the events of June 18th, 1815 were no more significant to them than any of the other battles that had been fought on that same ground across the centuries. The battle was effectively over. Napoleon's Imperial Guard had broken against Wellington's infantry. The French army was in full retreat toward Charleroi, and Blücher's Prussians were arriving in strength to pursue them into the gathering darkness. Across the field at Mont-Saint-Jean, 47,000 men lay dead or wounded, packed so densely in some areas that it was impossible to walk without stepping on bodies. The living moved among them like ghosts themselves, searching for friends, stripping the dead of valuables, crying out for water. The smoke was beginning to clear as the wind shifted, and the summer sun, which had finally broken through the clouds an hour before sunset, now cast long shadows across a landscape that no longer resembled farmland, but rather some medieval vision of hell. Lieutenant James Hamilton of the Scots Greys was among the survivors making their way back to the British lines. His horse had been killed beneath him during the retreat from the French guns, and he had continued on foot, collecting other dismounted dragoons as he went. By the time he reached the Ohain Road, he commanded a ragged group of 8 men, 3 from his own regiment, 2 Inniskillings, and 3 from the Royals. They were all wounded to some degree, exhausted beyond measure, and operating on the last reserves of discipline that kept soldiers functional even after their bodies had surrendered. Hamilton's plan was simple: follow the Ohain Road west until they reached a British position, report in, and then collapse. Nothing else mattered. They entered the sunken lane where it cut through the eastern edge of the battlefield near the farm of Papelotte. The banks rose 10 feet on either side, closing out most of the remaining daylight, and the bottom of the lane was churned to thick mud by the passage of troops throughout the day. Hamilton noticed the cold first, a sudden drop in temperature that made no sense for early summer evening, the kind of bone-deep chill he associated with winter nights in the peninsula. His breath misted in front of his face. Behind him, one of the Inniskillings said quietly, "Sir," and Hamilton turned to see what the man was pointing at. They were not alone in the lane. Ahead of them, perhaps 40 yards distant, was the cavalry formation that multiple witnesses had glimpsed throughout the day. But now there was no smoke to obscure them. no chaos of battle to distract the eye. Hamilton could see them with perfect clarity. 32 riders in 2 ranks, mounted on horses of uniform gray, wearing uniforms that belonged to no contemporary army. The coats were dark gray wool, cut in a style Hamilton recognized from paintings, the riding coat of cavalry from the War of Spanish Succession, more than a century out of date. The helmets were blackened steel with brass trim, some bearing dents that suggested combat use, and the riders themselves sat their mounts with the rigid posture of men who had learned to ride in an era when cavalry was the decisive arm of any army. Hamilton raised his hand, intending to hail them, and that was when he noticed that none of them were breathing. In the cold air that had settled into the lane, every living thing produced visible breath. His own men were surrounded by small clouds of mist, the kind that appears on frosty mornings. But the mounted figures ahead showed nothing. Their horses, standing perfectly still, did not steam or heave despite the temperature. And in the silence that had fallen, Hamilton realized he could not hear them either. No creak of leather, no stamp of hooves, no jingle of equipment. They were absolutely impossibly silent. One of his men, a corporal from the Royals named Davies, who had fought through the entire Peninsula campaign without flinching, took a step backward. "Sir, we need to leave this lane. Right now." His voice was steady, but carried the kind of certainty that comes from pure instinct. Hamilton was about to agree when the formation ahead moved, not forward toward them, but in column of 4s, executing a wheel to the left with parade ground precision. They turned 90 degrees and began to advance up a farm track that intersected the sunken road, moving away from Hamilton's position at a walk. He could see individual details now, the braiding on their coats, the scabbards hanging at precise angles, the way the fading sunlight seemed to pass through them rather than reflecting off metal and leather as it should. The rider at the rear of the column turned his head as he passed the intersection, and for a moment, less than a second, but Hamilton would remember it with perfect clarity for the rest of his life, their eyes met. The face beneath the helmet was young, perhaps 25, with the kind of aristocratic features common among cavalry officers of good family. But the expression was wrong. Not hostile, not threatening, but utterly without recognition. Hamilton was looking at a man who saw nothing, who existed in a space where the Battle of Waterloo had not yet occurred, or had occurred so long ago that it no longer mattered. Then the rider looked away, and the column continued up the farm track, rising out of the sunken road and vanishing into the smoke that still drifted across the fields. Hamilton stood frozen for perhaps 10 seconds. Then Davies spoke again, more urgently. "Sir, there's more of them." Hamilton turned. Behind his small group, blocking the way they had come, was another formation. This one was larger, perhaps 50 riders, and their uniforms were different, older still, dating perhaps to the 17th century, heavy cavalry in 3/4 armor, with closed helmets and long straight swords. They sat their horses in perfect stillness, facing Hamilton's men, close enough that he could see the dents and scratches on their breastplates, the rust staining at the joints of their armor. And they were waiting. Not attacking, not withdrawing, simply present, an impassable barrier that existed not in space but in some other dimension that overlaid the physical world. One of the Scots Greys, a private named MacLeod, began to pray in Gaelic. The sound of it seemed to break whatever spell had held them, and Hamilton found he could move again. He pointed up the western bank of the lane where tree roots and erosion had created a natural stairway. "Climb. Now, do not look back." His men needed no further encouragement. They scrambled up the bank, hauling each other over the lip, and tumbled into the field above. Hamilton was the last to climb, and before he pulled himself over the edge, he allowed himself one final glance into the lane. Both formations were still there, the older cavalry behind them and the 18th century Dragoons ahead, and now a third group was visible farther west. Riders in medieval armor, their horses caparisoned in styles he recognized from illuminated manuscripts. The sunken road was filled with cavalry from different centuries, all facing different directions, all moving through their own versions of battles that had been fought and forgotten on this same ground. Hamilton hauled himself into the field and ran. His men were already 50 yards ahead, and he caught up with them near a shattered elm tree where they had collapsed in exhaustion. None of them spoke about what they had seen. They lay in the mud, breathing hard, staring at the darkening sky, and waited for their hearts to slow. After perhaps 10 minutes, they rose and continued west until they found a British picket line. Hamilton reported to the first officer he encountered, gave his name and regiment, and requested permission for his men to rest. The officer, a young captain from the 51st Foot, granted it without question. He did not ask where they had been or what they had seen. The battlefield after Waterloo was full of men who had witnessed things they could not explain. Later that night, as Hamilton sat by a small fire and tried to write a report for his commanding officer, knowing even as he did so that he would not include what had happened in the O'Hain Road, he overheard a conversation between two Dutch-Belgian militiamen. They were speaking in Flemish, and Hamilton's command of that language was poor, but he understood enough to catch the meaning. They were talking about de oude Ruiters, the old riders. One of them was saying that his grandfather had seen them before the Battle of Ramillies in 1706, and his great-grandfather before him had seen them in 1489. They always appeared when the ground was about to drink blood, the militiaman said. They were not ghosts exactly, but something older, cavalry who had fought on this land so many times that they had become part of it, bound to the earth and the cycles of violence that returned to the same killing grounds across centuries. Hamilton set down his pen. He would not write about the Grey Riders, but he would never forget them. And in the years that followed, as he rose through the ranks and eventually retired with the rank of colonel, he would sometimes meet other Waterloo veterans at dinners or regimental gatherings. And occasionally, very carefully, he would ask if they had seen anything unusual during the battle. Most would say no, but a few, always a few, would meet his eyes with a look of recognition and relief, grateful to finally speak with someone who understood that what they had witnessed in the sunken road was neither delusion nor cowardice, but something far older and stranger than the war between Napoleon and Wellington. The morning after Waterloo brought the grim mathematics of victory. Wellington's army had lost 15,000 men killed or wounded, nearly 23% of his force. The French had lost between 25 and 30,000, with an additional 8,000 captured. The Prussians, who had arrived late in the battle but pursued the French through the night, added another 7,000 casualties to the total. The field itself was carpeted with bodies, some 47,000 dead and wounded men concentrated in an area of less than 3 square miles. The wounded who could not walk lay where they had fallen, crying for water or help or simply moaning in pain. Many would not survive another night. The work of burying the dead would take more than a week, and even then, it would be incomplete. Burial details from both armies began the process of clearing the field shortly after dawn. The work was methodical and horrifying, bodies stripped of anything valuable, sorted by army and rank when possible, then tumbled into mass graves dug wherever the ground was soft enough to excavate. The smell was already becoming unbearable as the summer heat accelerated decomposition. Soldiers detailed to burial duty wrapped cloth around their faces and worked in shifts, unable to endure more than an hour at a time. Officers walked among them, compiling casualty lists, identifying the dead when uniforms or personal effects made identification possible. Most of the bodies would never be identified. They would simply disappear into the earth, marked by mass graves that would eventually be plowed over and returned to farmland. But there were anomalies in the aftermath, details that did not fit the expected pattern of a battlefield's grim accounting. Multiple burial parties reported finding bodies in locations that made no tactical sense. Cavalry troopers dead in areas where no cavalry action had occurred, men killed by wounds that did not match any weapon used in the battle, clusters of dead horses with no visible injuries. A sergeant from the 52nd Foot, supervising a burial detail near the Ohain Road, discovered 11 bodies dressed in uniforms he did not recognize, wearing equipment that appeared to be from an earlier period. He assumed they were French cavalry in obsolete uniforms and had them buried in a mass grave with other enemy dead. He noted in his report that the bodies seemed oddly preserved, showing less decomposition than would be expected given the heat and elapsed time, but he attributed this to the cooler temperatures in the sunken road. Similar reports came from other sectors. A Belgian civilian hired to help with body recovery found what he described as ancient soldiers near the farm of Papillotte, men in armor that predated the Napoleonic era by more than a century, their bodies rigid and cold in a way that seemed wrong even for corpses. He refused to touch them and demanded additional payment before he would continue working. The British officer supervising him dismissed the account as local superstition and had the bodies removed by regular soldiers who noted nothing unusual except that the armor was genuine medieval plate, not reproduction, and showed signs of having been worn in combat. These bodies were not buried with the others, but were set aside for later examination. They vanished during the night, and no record of their subsequent disposition exists in any official document. The most detailed account came from Captain William Syborn, a military topographer who would spend the next 20 years creating an enormous scale model of the Waterloo battlefield. Syborn arrived 4 days after the battle to begin his survey work, measuring elevations, pacing distances, and interviewing survivors about the positions of various units throughout the engagement. While mapping the Ohain Road on the 23rd of June, he encountered something that disrupted his otherwise meticulous methodology. In his private journal, not the official survey notes, but a separate document he kept for observations that did not fit into formal reports, he recorded the following. The lane exhibits peculiar qualities that defy rational explanation. Temperature within the sunken road measures consistently 8 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit lower than the surrounding fields, despite adequate sun exposure and no obvious geographic cause. Horses refuse to enter the eastern section of the lane near Papillotte, requiring significant force to compel passage. Local civilians avoid this section entirely, citing generations of family prohibition. Most disturbing. On 3 separate occasions at dusk, I have observed what appeared to be mounted figures moving through the lane, visible for 2 to 5 seconds before disappearing. I have verified this is not smoke, mist, or shadow play. The figures maintain military formation and appear to be cavalry of indeterminate period. I cannot account for this phenomenon and have ceased surveying the lane after dark. Syborn never published these observations. His famous model of Waterloo, which required testimony from hundreds of veterans and years of painstaking research, makes no mention of the Grey Riders or any of the anomalous sightings reported during and after the battle. But his private papers, discovered in the 1920s and now held in the British Library, contain multiple references to unexplained cavalry formations and persistent local reports of phantom riders. He appears to have collected these accounts systematically, interviewing at least 37 veterans who reported seeing unusual mounted figures during the battle. He never drew any conclusions from this data. He simply recorded it as if documenting a phenomenon he could not explain but felt compelled to preserve. By the end of June, most of the British and Prussian armies had departed Belgium, moving into France to occupy Paris and ensure Napoleon's final abdication. The battlefield at Waterloo was returned to the local farmers, who would spend years clearing debris, unexploded ordnance, and the last remnants of that terrible day. The sunken Ohain Road, damaged by artillery and churned by the passage of thousands of troops, was repaired and returned to agricultural use. The fields were replanted. Life continued. Within 5 years, a visitor to Mont Saint-Jean would have seen little evidence that anything significant had occurred there, Beyond a few monuments and the Lion's Mound, an artificial hill constructed from earth scraped from the battlefield itself, crowned with a cast-iron lion to commemorate the spot where the Prince of Orange was wounded. But the locals remembered. Farmers working fields near the Ojine Road reported continued sightings of cavalry moving through the mist on early mornings, particularly in June. Children were warned not to play in certain sections of the sunken lane, though their parents could not articulate exactly why beyond "it's not safe." Animals continued to show reluctance to enter specific areas of the battlefield, even decades after the last bones had been cleared and the last cannonball recovered. The phenomenon persisted through generations, becoming part of the landscape's folklore, another layer in the accumulated memory of a place where violence had been perpetrated so intensely and so often that it had left a permanent mark. In 1890, an historian researching the battle interviewed an elderly woman whose grandfather had been a boy of 12 in 1815, living on a farm within sight of the battlefield. She recalled him saying that the Grey Riders had been seen for as long as anyone could remember, long before Napoleon or Wellington, long before the French Revolution, stretching back to wars whose names had been forgotten. They were not ghosts of Waterloo, he had said. Waterloo was simply another battle they had witnessed, another layer of dead added to the ground they rode. They would still be there long after everyone who fought at Waterloo had died, because they were not bound to any single conflict. They were bound to the ground itself, to the Ojine Road and the fields around it, condemned or privileged, he could not say which, to ride forever through battles that repeated in endless variation across the centuries. The official record of the Battle of Waterloo is one of the most thoroughly documented military engagements in history. Wellington's dispatch to Earl Bathurst, written the day after the battle, runs to several thousand words and names dozens of officers who distinguished themselves. Prussian reports, French accounts from both sides of the political divide, Belgian civilian testimonies, and letters from soldiers of every rank have been collected, analyzed, and published in volumes that fill library shelves. Yet nowhere in this vast documentary record is there any mention of the Grey Riders, the Phantom Cavalry, or any of the anomalous sightings reported by multiple credible witnesses during and after the engagement. This absence is not accidental. Within 3 weeks of the battle, someone began a systematic effort to suppress these accounts. The process was subtle and deniable. Reports were misfiled, witness statements edited to remove problematic passages, journal entries copied into official records with certain sections omitted. No direct order exists commanding this suppression. Instead, what emerges from the fragmentary evidence is a pattern of institutional housekeeping, the kind of quiet editorial work that ensures the historical record remains comprehensible and useful. Accounts that could not be explained within the rational framework of early 19th century military science were simply allowed to disappear, not destroyed, but archived in ways that made them difficult to locate or cross-reference. The most revealing document in this process is a memorandum dated August 4, 1815, written by Colonel Henry Torrens, military secretary at the Horse Guards in London. The memo is addressed to no one. It exists as a note to file, the kind of internal documentation that records decisions made without requiring formal approval. Torrens writes, "Multiple reports from Waterloo contain references to unexplained phenomena that, while attested by officers of unquestionable character, cannot be included in official histories without inviting ridicule or worse. These accounts are to be preserved separately under administrative seal, available for review only upon specific request and with appropriate justification. Public record will reflect only those observations compatible with rational military analysis." This policy appears to have been implemented immediately and maintained for more than a century and a half. Captain Siborne's collection of anomalous testimonies was never incorporated into his published works on Waterloo, despite being meticulously documented in his private papers. Lieutenant Hamilton's journal, which contained the most detailed account of the encounter in the Ohain Road, was edited by his family before being donated to the regimental archives. 3 pages had been carefully removed, leaving only stub edges in the binding. Cornet Kinchant's written statement about the Grey Riders exists in 2 versions, a complete account in his personal papers, and a redacted version in the official after-action reports, where all references to unexplained cavalry have been replaced with vague mentions of confusion in the smoke. The suppression extended beyond official military channels. When journalists or historians attempted to investigate the phenomenon, they encountered a consistent pattern of obstruction. Parish records that allegedly contained pre-1815 references to Les Cavaliers Gris could not be located, despite clear catalog entries indicating they should exist. Belgian witnesses who had spoken freely to British officers in the immediate aftermath of the battle became suddenly reluctant to discuss the matter when approached by researchers years later. The Belgian government, sensitive to maintaining good relations with Britain and wary of encouraging local superstitions that might damage the growing battlefield tourism industry, actively discouraged academic inquiry into folkloric aspects of the Waterloo campaign. But suppression is never complete. Information once created persists in unexpected places. Private letters escaped censorship because no one thought to censor personal correspondence. Family stories passed down orally retained details that official records had excised, and the phenomenon itself continued, indifferent to whether anyone acknowledged it. Throughout the 19th and into the 20th century, witnesses continued to report cavalry sightings near the Ohain Road. The reports followed a consistent pattern: mounted figures in outdated uniforms, moving in formation, visible briefly before disappearing, always in the same locations where the 1815 witnesses had seen them. In 1914, as the First World War began and British troops once again moved through Belgium, several soldiers from the British Expeditionary Force reported seeing cavalry that matched descriptions from 1815. A lieutenant from the Royal Sussex Regiment bivouacked near the Waterloo battlefield while his unit awaited rail transport, wrote to his sister about encountering horsemen in very old uniform, possibly from the Napoleonic period, riding through our encampment at dawn without acknowledging our presence. He was killed at Mons 3 weeks later, and his letter survived only because his sister preserved it. Similar reports emerged during the Second World War, when Allied forces liberated Belgium in 1944. American soldiers, with no knowledge of Waterloo's history or local folklore, described seeing cavalry in Revolutionary War uniforms, the closest reference point they possessed for late 18th century military dress, moving through fields near Mont Saint-Jean. The most recent documented sighting occurred on June 18, 1982, the 167th anniversary of the battle. A group of British military historians conducting a staff ride of the battlefield, a training exercise where officers walk the terrain to understand tactical decisions, were mapping the Ohain Road at approximately 7 in the evening when all 6 members of the group simultaneously observed a cavalry formation moving through the sunken lane. The sighting lasted perhaps 20 seconds. All 6 officers were experienced military professionals, including 2 lieutenant colonels and a brigadier. Their official report, filed with the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, describes the observation in careful, clinical language and makes no attempt to explain it. The report concludes, "Phenomenon observed and documented. No explanation consistent with known physical principles can be offered. Recommend continued monitoring." That recommendation has been implemented quietly. Since 1982, the British Army maintains an informal watch on the Waterloo battlefield, particularly around the anniversary of the battle. Officers stationed in Belgium are briefed on the phenomenon as part of their cultural orientation, though the briefing is framed as historical curiosity rather than active intelligence concern. Sightings continue to be reported occasionally, perhaps once or twice per decade, and each report is documented, filed, and added to a collection that now spans more than 200 years. No official investigation has been conducted, no resources allocated to study the phenomenon systematically. It simply exists, acknowledged privately and ignored publicly. Another classified file in the vast archive of things the military has witnessed but cannot explain. The folklore connection, suppressed in 1815 but preserved in local memory, provides the only framework for understanding what these sightings represent. The ground around Mont Saint-Jean has been a battlefield since at least the Roman period. Archaeological excavations have uncovered evidence of conflicts dating to the 5th century, medieval arms and armor from multiple periods, and mass graves from wars whose names have been lost. The Ohain Road itself follows a route that predates written records, one of the ancient tracks that connected settlements long before Belgium existed as a nation. It is, in the most literal sense, a place where the dead have accumulated across millennia, where violence has been enacted so repeatedly that it has become part of the landscape's essential nature. If the witnesses can be believed, and there is no reason to doubt the testimony of multiple credible observers across 2 centuries, then what appears at Waterloo is not the ghost of any particular battle, but something more fundamental, an echo or residue of cavalry warfare itself, repeated across so many conflicts on the same ground that it has achieved a kind of permanence. The Grey Riders are not the dead of Waterloo specifically. They are all the cavalry who have ever ridden that ground, collapsed into a single recurring phenomenon that manifests most strongly when conditions approach those of historical battles, early morning or evening light, mist or smoke in the air, and the presence of soldiers who unconsciously recreate the circumstances that first imprinted the phenomenon onto the landscape. The file remains open. The suppression continues, now more from institutional inertia than active policy. There is simply no framework within modern military doctrine for addressing phenomena that cannot be explained, measured, or controlled. But the Grey Riders continue their eternal patrol, bound to the Ohain Road and the fields of Mont Saint-Jean, visible to those who happen to be in the right place at the right time and willing to see what should not exist. They rode before Waterloo. They rode through Waterloo, and the evidence suggests they will continue riding long after the last veteran of 1815 has been forgotten, permanent as the ground itself, the phantom dragoons of a battle that never truly ended.